right. So the talk is called Achieving Abstraction, Early Competence, and the Role of the Learning Context. Oh, advancing slides. Okay. So early learning can seem pretty miraculous. From just a handful of observations, very young children are able to make predictions, they can generate actions, they can infer the existence of variables that they've never seen before. By 5 years of age or so, they've already developed these complex causal theories in a variety of domains, everything from understanding biological principles to other minds, to the nature of physical properties in the world, and many other things. And the question that motivates all of my research, but really the project of cognitive development more broadly, dating back to these guys, is how it is that we're actually able to do this. How are we able to learn these abstract, structured, causal representations of the world so quickly and accurately, given the relatively impoverished information that we're getting from our senses? And one classic answer from developmental psychology, and also the perspective that we take in my lab, points to the similarities that exist between children's learning and scientific theory change. So the idea here proposes that children's early theories share the same structure and the same function as theories in science, and that they also change in the same way. And in particular, that children, just like little scientists, are implicitly formulating hypotheses about the world, and then they're testing and rationally revising those hypotheses in light of evidence that they observe through their own play, or in observing other people, or hearing testimony, and all sorts of sources of evidence here. And today I'm going to be talking about the type of hypotheses that young children generate, and in particular, whether and when and in what context they're able to infer and apply abstract or higher order principles that go beyond the perceptual data that they're directly observing in the world. And this ability turns out to be super important. It's been suggested that for the type of rapid learning that we observe in young children to even be possible, right, their inferences really must be constrained by some more abstract concepts that influence how they interpret data as it's coming in. So from this perspective, these sort of lower level or object-based or perceptual data and these abstract higher order sorts of relational concepts are really developing more or less in tandem in order for this kind of learning to occur. So to illustrate this, I've always found this example super helpful, so I'll share it here, even though it's sort of used for a slightly different point. This is from Nelson Goodman. Imagine that you're presented with several bags of marbles, and you reach into the first bag, and the first marble that you randomly draw is white. And then you might not have much of an idea now of what else is contained inside this bag, or any of these bags for that matter. But if you reach back into this bag and the next 3 marbles that you randomly draw are also white, well, now you've got, a pretty good idea of what's in this bag. If you move to the next bag and the first 4 marbles that you randomly draw are red, and you move to the third bag and the first marble that you randomly draw is blue, not only are you going to be very likely to predict that any remaining marbles in this third bag are blue, but what you've done here is you've moved beyond your immediate observations to draw this more abstract or higher order generalization that bags contain things that are the same, right? In this case, the same color. Oops, there we go. So I don't have to tell this group that recognizing these type of abstract relations between superficially different objects and events turns out to be super central for the most basic processes underlying learning. It's also, of course, linked to success in content areas in education like science and math and literature, right? It supports concepts like waves and numbers and the themes of a story. And also these domain general learning abilities like knowledge transfer, right? Which is, of course, also dependent on recognizing this common abstract structure. But, right, despite playing such a central role for learning, it's long been suggested that abstract thinking must progress slowly and linearly from the concrete to the more abstract. And these ideas have been around in developmental psychology, at least since Piaget, so from the beginning. And there's a really good reason, I think, why these ideas have hung around for so long. which is that children are notoriously bad at looking beyond salient perceptual cues in their environment in order to infer these kinds of abstract relations. So, for example, the relations same and different have sort of long served as this case study for the development of abstract thinking more broadly. Just this summer, we've had several speakers focusing on these foundational concepts, and I'm going to do that too, for better or worse here. And they're so interesting, right? Because they're so essential to all the things that we do. And yet, even in a basic matching task like this one, where children are given a pair of same objects and asked to match to another pair, one in the same relation and one that shares this object in common, without some kind of training or intervention, preschoolers tend to strongly prefer the object match here. And even by 8.5, children are choosing between these two options at chance. In fact, this tendency is so robust in kids that even if you demonstrate how they should be matching to sort of reduce the ambiguity that's purposefully sort of inherent in this decontextualized task, they tend to persist in selecting the object match. So this is a 5-year-old. This is a control task for a study that I'll show you later. But I think it demonstrates this point that, like, even after observing the experimenters show them how they should be matching, well, you'll see what they do.
So you see this card here. You see these two cards. In my game, this card goes with this card. Can you point to the card that I said goes with this card? See this card. See these two cards. In my game, this card goes with this card. Can you point to the card that I said goes with this card? So now it's your turn. See this card? See these two cards? Which of these two cards goes with this one?
Okay, so hopefully you could see that even after these two demonstrations, she still sort of consistently defaulted to this object match here. And even in cases where there is no object match, so something like this, children will fail to spontaneously select the relation without some kind of feedback or training until 4 or 5 years of age. And the majority of past research in this tradition has interpreted these findings as evidence that children undergo this relational shift in which children's early similarity judgments within a particular domain or within a particular task are initially based on these sort of shared object properties, and then they shift to include these more abstract or relational concepts. And this is a very sticky idea, and as a result, much of the existing work has focused on the mechanisms underlying this shift, including the acquisition of domain-specific relational knowledge, relational language, and other people have talked about the maturation of cognitive, sort of domain general cognitive factors like executive function. In all cases, sort of trying to discover the underlying mechanism here for this shift. So with this intuitive picture and also background in mind, I'm going to argue for an alternative, but I think compatible perspective. I'm going to do this in 2 different parts. First, I'll show you some support that I found initially for early competence, focusing on toddlers. So these are babies 1.5 to 2.5. Then I'm going to provide some evidence suggesting that this is true competence, that it's not rooted only in perceptual processes, that it's abstract, and that it's flexible. And then in part 2, I'm going to try to explain why it is that older kids tend to fail, like the child in that video I showed you. And in particular, I'll describe some work on the role of the learning context here. And this will include both the global context, like language and culture, and just quick caveat that I'm going to be sort of rehashing some of the work that you saw from Alex Parsonson, who did this work with me earlier. I'll try to go through it quickly. And I guess that's the problem with this small group, is that there's a lot of overlap and collaborations here. But then I'll go on to talk about some other contextual factors of the local context, the local learning environment, and talk about how we might be able to manipulate this to either facilitate or suppress abstract reasoning in kids. Okay, so let's first talk about early competence here. Okay, so to begin, right, there's evidence that the foundations of relational reasoning are in place very early in human development, and other people before me this summer have talked about this, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. But preverbal infants can be habituated to pairs of same and different objects. They'll show increased looking time to the opposite relation at test after this exposure. In related paradigms by Jean-Remy Hutchman, right, they've shown that they can use this anticipatory looking behavior, and infants will do this, sort of anticipating the same relation. Infants also appear to recognize relational patterns. So this has appeared in work like this one from Duar and Chu, where similar to the Marbles test that I showed you earlier, children seem to be sensitive to these sort of abstract hypotheses, and then they'll be surprised if you violate that on a subsequent trial. And of course, also there's some related work that babies can discriminate and generalize patterns of things like repeated elements like ABA patterns, and they can do this in both visual and auditory domains. So when you sort of take all of this together and many other things, these data seem to suggest early competence, at least in recognizing and even anticipating these relational concepts very early on. And then as a first step in showing some early competence in a more active behavioral task, we decided when I was in graduate school to take the standard relational reasoning task sort of out of the land of abstract shapes and present children with a causal learning task that would require that they infer these same different concepts and then use them in order to produce a novel effect. So to do this, we just sort of swapped out the traditional parts with a Blickett detector paradigm. For those of you who don't know what this is, we use this all the time in the causal learning literature. It's just a flexible causal system. It's basically a machine that will light up or play music when some things are put on top, right, causing it to activate, and will do nothing when other things are placed on top. But critically, in contrast to all of the previous studies on causal inference, the causal relationship here really depended on whether the objects were the same or different, rather than the properties of the objects themselves, which is what has traditionally been looked at in these tasks. So again, these are 18 to 30-month-olds, so pretty young kids. There were two conditions, one for same, one for different. This is the design for the same condition. So you see pairs of objects on the toy. Those little lines indicate that it's playing music. Pairs of different objects don't make it play. They see two pairs of each type interleaved in this way. And then they're given a single test trial. So two novel pairs, there's no object match here. An incorrect pair in the different relation and a correct pair in the same relation. We also have a different condition, which is sort of a nice feature of this experiment, is that we use all the same blocks and we just reverse the pattern of activation here, right? So now it's the different blocks that activate the toy and the same blocks don't, and they get the same test trial. But of course now their response should be the opposite, to select the opposite pair. So they sort of serve as controls for one another. It's fun to watch little kids do this. This child is, I think, 23 months, so she's just about to turn 2.
I have this machine. And do you want to know what's cool about this machine? Sometimes when I put things on top, it plays music. And other times when I put things on top, it does not play music. Can I show you how it works? Let's see how it works. Let's try these ones, okay? Let's try these ones first. Music! Do you hear the song? It's playing music. Let's try these ones again, okay? Let's see. Music! Yay! These ones made my toy play music. Now look, we have these ones, okay? Let's try these ones now. No music. I don't hear anything. Let's try these ones again. No music. These ones did not make my toy play music.
Okay.
Lilia.
So this goes on for 2 more trials, one more same, one more different. I find it so hard not to smile when I watch Sophie run kids. Sophie Bridgers is the experimenter here. Here's the test trial.
Now I need your help finding the things that will make my toy play music. I have 2 options for you, okay? 2 options. You see? I have these ones and I have these ones. And only one of these trays has things that will make my toy play music. Lilia, which one will make my toy play music? Those ones.
Okay. So Lilia did very well here, and toddlers do very well, performing around 80% of the time. It was identical between the same and different concepts in this causal task. And since then, these results have been replicated almost identically in other published work. So several different times in several different contexts. I feel quite confident about these findings. But these initial results demonstrated for the first time, right, that this ability here in this causal task seems to be in place pretty early in human development. But as I pointed out previously, right, these results also challenge this sort of theory that even much older children, right, based on the prior work, should have difficulty inferring same different relations in these active or behavioral tasks. So we assumed that it was the causal learning context that did all the work here. And in fact, Mario Gadou has some recent work showing that causal contexts do support relational reasoning. So that's sort of what we thought the story was going to be for this paper. And so we took older kids, 3-year-olds, who tend to fail these kinds of relational match to sample tasks in previous work, and we gave them this identical task. And to our surprise, unlike toddlers, these older children fail to infer the abstract relation in the exact same task. So their performance just sort of drops to chance. So the second finding is actually quite compatible and consistent with all the previous literature here that shows failure of preschool age children, their sort of inability to succeed on these kinds of relational reasoning tasks. And in this paper, at the end of this paper, the second paper, we suggested that children must have learned to privilege these object-based hypotheses, and that they learn this at the expense of these abstract relational ones, right? And so if it's learned, then it makes sense that the bias should be stronger for older children who've had more experience interacting with objects in the world. Now, to be clear, many people have proposed that children's failure on abstract reasoning tasks is because of a focus on objects. But all of the previous work proposed that children start with objects and then slowly learn to reason with relations, right, which comes later. So in other words, they've claimed reasonably that knowing more should aid learning, right? What we propose here is different. It's that knowing less might have actually aided younger children in picking up on the relational hypothesis here. In other words, their early competence is overshadowed by this learned bias to attend to individual objects. So at the end of this paper, we propose the presence of a U-shaped developmental trajectory where younger children have no trouble generating abstract hypotheses, then at least same and different, older children temporarily fail before going on to succeed. And the line is dashed because I haven't actually run this causal study with 5-year-olds, but we can assume from the existing literature using more standard and more challenging tasks that children should succeed by 5 years of age on this task. But of course, this proposal left open a whole host of challenges and questions, both about the initial peak and also about the dip in performance. The first question that we got was like, are toddlers really doing this? Are they really demonstrating an abstract understanding of same and different? And then a second question is, if they can reason abstractly, what is going on with the older kids here? Or how did they learn how to fail? And is there anything that can sort of show that we can address this failure in these tasks? So I'm going to start with the first question and provide some more evidence for early competence in this age group. So everything I'm going to show you in this first part is with 1 to 2-year-olds, 18 to 30-month-olds. Okay, so the first critics of our claim argued that the protocol lacks the power, even in principle, to demonstrate genuine conceptual understanding. They claim that toddler success might just be mediated here by perceptual factors. So here's the problem, right? It's clear that humans and non-human animals are able to notice or perceive the similarity that exists between things, right? This ability is essential for all sorts of things, for basic functions like recognition and familiarity, right? But just noticing similarity doesn't necessarily require the learner to have an abstract conceptual representation with the content same, right? So it's possible that toddlers' success in our studies is just grounded in their use of low-level heuristics that are based on the visual properties of the display. And then later, this low-level strategy is abandoned because they're trying to use a conceptual one and they don't have the concept yet, right? So they fail. So this is pretty compelling. And so in fact, there's this growing evidence that success that's seen in non-human animals on these kinds of tasks, they use these arrays, right? They provide animals with a sample array, and then they have to match these two other arrays that sort of show same and different, that these tasks are grounded, maybe grounded in perceptual expertise that's learned over the course of reinforcement trials, usually many reinforcement trials. And one candidate here is this low-level heuristic referred to as perceptual entropy, which captures the amount of variance that exists in a visual display. So animals can succeed on this task if they use a rule like, if variability of the sample is high, right, select the choice that has high variability. And so this suggests that tasks that have sort of historically served as a standard for assessing same different understanding across species might actually be able to be passed, even in the absence of these genuine conceptual representations of same and different. And in fact, Susan Carey's lab has some cool evidence suggesting that humans might also be sensitive to sort of picking up on entropy in these kinds of arrays. I can't remember if Jean Remy talked about that, but he might have. Okay, so despite the clear differences between these array paradigms over many, many trials and those that we used here in our study, it does seem intuitive, right, that younger children and infants, right, in these looking time tasks might be just responding to some sort of perceptual analysis of the stimuli pairs, right, rather than this using this kind of same different strategy. And so this attention to variance would subsume a whole range of perceptual cues, including symmetry, oddity, contrast, spatial orientation, a whole bunch of stuff, right? So in other words, they could sort of look at these same pairs and just see low variance, less stuff going on. Look at the different pairs, see high variance, more stuff going on, and then just match this information to the test pairs without ever using a conceptual representation. So that's what we aim to assess in this study. All we did was we used this method that was designed to pit the sort of perceptual cues and the concept against each other. And so we contrasted two conditions. We used the causal relational test that I've already shown you, but in one case, right, we used the typical pairs. And in the other case, we fused the pairs together. That sounds very fancy. We literally glued them together, right, to make these sort of single, more complex objects. So hopefully it's clear here, right, that the amount of perceptual variance is now matched between the two conditions. There's the same amount of stuff going on here when you're comparing same to different pairs or objects. But right, the fuse condition doesn't provide any evidence for the relationship same between items here, right? So if children are just relying on a perceptual heuristic like symmetry or oddity or spatial orientation, they should select the lower variance pair in the same condition consistently across conditions. They should be able to use these cues, right, these perceptual cues. But if they're actually learning the abstract relation between objects, then they should only succeed in the unfused or sort of previous case, right, in the causal relational test that I already showed you. Okay, I have a slide to make it really clear, but I think hopefully it's clear. Yeah, I'm going to skip this one. Okay, so that is actually what we find. So we find the significant difference here between conditions, with children in the unfused condition performing above chance. So this is just replicating that study one that I showed you a while ago. And then when we glued the objects together to form these single objects that shared all these perceptual features, they nevertheless dropped to chance. So these are the younger kids, right? So it seems that these younger children only learn and generalize the relationship same when there's actually a relation between objects here to learn. And they don't succeed when they're presented just with these sort of lower level cues on their own. And in fact, when you sort of look at these new results on the right in the younger children in the fused condition, and you compare them with our previous experiments, we see that toddlers in the fused condition now look like our preschoolers at baseline, right? Compared to our toddlers in the unfused or original condition. Okay. Another question we had that also sort of addresses this, but sort of goes beyond this, is how abstract these early concepts are. So you might imagine, for example, a very narrow interpretation of same, like same color and same shape blocks, right? This doesn't necessarily generalize to other instances of the concept, which is what we'd like an actual relational concept to do. So in the next set of studies, we really tried to push the boundary a bit on children's ability to infer and apply these concepts across modalities. So in one study, we taught them the concept same or different using only shape as a cue. So you can see here, right, colors are relevant because it's the same across all items, so it doesn't predict activation of the toy. The only thing that predicts activation is whether the shapes are the same shape, right? Colors held constant. I should note, the other way to do this is to make color irrelevant by varying it across items, which is a bit harder, right? Because there's more stuff going on here. And so we were in the process of running this study when the pandemic hit. So I can't tell you the results from that one, but I do have results from the sort of easier version. So that, I guess, works in my favor here. So regardless, color remains constant. The only thing that changes here is shape. And then at test, we switch the relevant factor here, right? So now shape is held constant. Both test pairs include items that are the identical shape. And the only thing that's different here is color, right? So to make the correct choice, they have to override the sort of same shape hypothesis they might have thought of before, ignore this previously salient perceptual cue in order to attend to the previously irrelevant cue, which is color, right? Because if they were only attending to shape, they should choose a chance because both of these options are the same shape. Does that make sense? So children have no problem doing this. Again, these are 18 to 30-month-olds. They perform well above chance, at least on experiment 1A. Like I said, we just started experiment 1B. So stay tuned for that. Okay, then in another experiment in the same paper, we ran a different manipulation to see if they could generalize these concepts from visual properties like shape and color to other kinds of properties like category labels. So to do this, we gave them the same set of training trials as the original study, just same and different blocks, right? Make it go. And then at test, we gave them 2 pairs of identical blocks. They were the same shape and color. You couldn't tell them apart by visual appearance. And we picked them each up and we labeled them. So there was one pair over here. We said, this is a Blickett, this is a Blickett. So they have the same label. Went over here, this is a Dax, this is a Toma. So they have different labels. And the question was, can children sort of apply same that they learn from visual properties to same in the context of a shared category label? And again, we find that children of this age group have no trouble doing this either, which is pretty cool. Okay. This is my favorite one. So toddlers are actually so good at this that they can flexibly apply either object-based or relational hypotheses under conditions of uncertainty, depending on the test choices that they're given at test. So this work was just published with Mariel Gadou in Child Development. It's not out yet. So in this study, we presented children with the completely ambiguous set of training trials here. So let me talk you through why it's ambiguous. So you see here that there's actually 2 different hypotheses for what might make this toy activate, right? One is the relational hypothesis that we've been talking about. It could be that different objects make it go. But there's this other thing, right? Because we took this blue square and it appears twice now in both of these activating pairs. So it could also be, it's perfectly reasonable, right? To have the hypothesis that blue squares or an object-based hypothesis is the thing that makes it go. It's ambiguous, right? We can't tell. So then we did this both between subjects and within subjects, but I'll describe the between study. We have the relational condition here. So half of the toddlers were assigned to see these test pairs. So this is just the test pairs that we showed them in the original study, 2 novel test pairs, same and different, right? But we had another condition. Half of the children received these test pairs, right? So one is the object, right? That, oops, sorry. One is the object that's associated with both cases of activation. And the other one is another object that was also associated with the effect. And half of the kids saw the yellow ball in this example, and half of the kids would have seen the other one. Right? And the question is, do children select the correct choice that's consistent with both the object-based hypothesis and the relational hypothesis from the same set of data? And we find that they do. So these are toddlers, so this is basically ceiling performance, right? So they're 86% correct on the relational pair, which matches the previous work, and they're 80% correct on the object pair. So this seems to provide, and this works within subjects too. The effects are weaker. In that study, we basically just gave them the relational or object first, and then they made a choice, and then we didn't give them feedback. We took them away, and then we put out the other test pair for the same child, and they made a second choice. And even there, we find that children are correct at above chance performance. So this seems to provide evidence not only for children's ability to sort of simultaneously infer hypotheses at multiple levels of abstraction, which is actually what this paper is about, but also, right, relevant here for this talk, that they can hold both object-based and relational hypotheses in mind simultaneously and then flexibly apply either one, depending on the needs of the particular learning context that they're in. Okay, so to summarize the first half of the talk here, toddlers show early competence inferring these relational concepts in this causal learning task. These concepts appear to be both abstract and flexible. And then what we propose is that with age, this competence is overshadowed temporarily by a learned bias to attend to objects and object properties. So this introduces a pretty different developmental story, because if the object bias here is learned, there should be learning contexts that don't result in this same bias, which is what I'll talk about in the second part. So I'm gonna take water here. Are there any, so we can either save questions to the end, or if you have any questions about section 1, I can answer them now. It's up to you all. Okay, I'll keep going. There'll be time at the end, and I'm happy to return to this section. Okay. So one possibility, and this will remind you of the talk that Alice Carsonson gave a while ago. I'm going to go through these data as well because we did this work together. Is that the object bias might be partly driven, or at least encouraged, by patterns of language learning. So actually, this was initially proposed by Hoyos and Gentner, and then Alex and I started talking about it, and we sort of designed this study on the basis of that proposal, and it winds up being a bit different. And in particular here, right, that children's emphasis on nouns, which form the bulk of their vocabulary in early life, may focus their attention to objects, right? And this is Alex's slide. So the idea here is that nouns refer to these concrete individual entities in the environment, and they often direct learners' focus to object properties like color and shape when you're picking out their meanings, right? So it's possible that this attention to objects, right, this obsession with nouns might impede their ability to notice relations. On the other hand, verbs tend to emphasize these relational meanings across multiple subjects. And so you might expect that attention to those features would sort of boost kind of relational reasoning instead, right? And conveniently, the focus on nouns turns out not to be universal across languages. Children learning Mandarin Chinese produce more verbs, relatively speaking, in their early language in use. And so this cross-linguistic difference presents these two natural conditions in word learning, which we can exploit here as a test of the proposal that the properties that are emphasized in word learning induce an object bias more generally. And so we decided to run this cross-linguistic study to see whether the bias we observe in older children could be partly due to an emphasis on learning nouns or other linguistic features in early childhood. And we figured if we look at native speakers of languages that lack a similar noun focus, right, speakers of Mandarin Chinese, we might not see this decline. So to do this, we first replicated the original causal relational task that I've shown you several times now. All of this work this is with 3-year-olds, by the way, right? So now we're switching from the little kids that are quite competent to the older kids that fail in the US. These are 3-year-olds. They got both same and different conditions, followed by the single test choice. And we found, interestingly, no evidence for failure in Chinese speakers at 3 years of age on the same task, compared to, here's the data for the English speakers who, to remind you, are chance at this age. So we were really curious about the developmental trajectory. So in a second experiment, we expanded the age range to include children leading up to this point. So from the point that they start showing success in the US at 18 months, up to the point at which we know that they fail at 36 months. So this 1.5-year window sort of leading up to failure in the US. And what we see here, so the y-axis is their proportion of relational choices. The x-axis is age in months, starting from 18 months, going up to 48 months. Okay? And what you see is that they start off doing well in both contexts, right? Performing over chance. But then you see this like dip, right? This U-shape, what we're thinking of as a U-shaped trajectory in the US. And they sort of are down at chance by the time they hit 3 years of age. In China, we see this essentially flat trajectory. If anything, it's sort of going up a little bit, right? So these seem to be pretty distinct trajectories of relational reasoning over this pretty broad age window here. So we're next interested in how these Chinese speakers might respond to the ambiguous case that I just showed you, right, with the toddlers. It's a little bit different here, so I'm just going to walk you through it one more time. So here we gave them these ambiguous data. So again, they're consistent both with a relational hypothesis, different, and also an object hypothesis, which is the blue square, right? They're both reasonable responses here. And the question is, you know, if we pit these options against each other, so we took the two blue squares and we brought them together to make a relational pair that's wrong, right? So this is wrong with respect to the relation and correct with respect to the object. So if you're paying attention to objects, you might think that this is the right choice. And we took the other two objects that were also associated with the effect, but didn't predict it, right? And those became the relational match. So this is correct with respect to the different relation, but incorrect with respect to the object. And we predicted that if Chinese speakers have this bias to attend to relations, right, they would be more likely to ignore the object match and pay attention to the relational match instead. And that's exactly what we find. So you see here a pretty clear difference in bias with English speakers more likely to privilege the object match, which is actually pretty hard to do because they have to remember it, right? And the Mandarin speaker is more likely to privilege the relational match, with a significant difference here between groups. So we concluded from this then that there's these naturally occurring population level differences in relational and object focus, that these appear early in development, right? At least by 18 months. And that these lead to these qualitative differences in the trajectory of relational reasoning that predicts differences in performance on tasks like this, right? And other tasks, presumably. So is the object bias unique then to some global contexts and not to others? Maybe, right? So we didn't find any evidence for decline in Chinese speakers. This means that either an emphasis on nouns or many, many, many other linguistic features, right? So you all know this work better than I do. I'm not a language person necessarily, that's Alex's job, but there's lots of features in language, right, that differ between these two languages that might account for this difference, the quantity of nouns and verb tokens, production of nouns, comprehension of nouns, word order, pronoun dropping, there's a whole bunch of things, right? It's hard to study these effects on language. And not only that, right, but other things might play a role too. So you probably noticed or recall from Alex's talk that a focus on relations is also predicted by a collectivist context like the one that we know about in China. Other people have pointed this out prior to me, which emphasize that the relations between members of a group rather than this individual or entity focus that we see in the US would be consistent, right, with sort of a bias to attend to relations in their environment. And so when we set out to do this, this again is work with Alex, spearheaded by her, but obviously many other colleagues around the world here. And we just got funding to do this study, which is pretty ambitious. Like language, isolating cultural factors is a bit of a mess. It's not well defined, and I'm not an expert in cultural psychology. So what we originally tried to do is make a sort of quadrant, right, where we have individualistic to collectivistic culture on the one axis, we have noun heavy to verb heavy on the other axis. We have the US and China that we already have data for that have these sort of opposite extremes. And then the question is, what happens when we sort of fill in these other quadrants, right? Will we find some evidence for the type of input that's going to matter here? So we're using Hungary as our individualist, but verb heavy language compared to English. And then we have these two other cultures. One is Mexico, which is convenient for us because we're on the border with Tijuana here, who are Spanish is noun heavy like English, but they are collectivist, but they're collectivist in a different way than South Korea, which is apparently also noun heavy. Mike Frank has some work showing this. But again, it's collectivist in a different way. We got a little bit bogged down here and we discovered that sort of this might be a more accurate representation. So we're now treating lexical bias as this continuum, right? With China showing greater verb bias than Hungary. And then individualism and collectivism has been replaced with this continuum of context sensitivity, which is something that's been explored, I know, by members of this group, with North America at one extreme, East Asia at the other extreme. Right. So either way, we should see some interesting differences in relational reasoning across locations. And the point here is that sort of by establishing population differences, regardless of the specific source, which I'm not convinced we're going to be able to isolate, but maybe I'm just being pessimistic, seeing differences already suggests a critical role for experience, right, in children's hypothesis generation here. So based on this evidence, we proposed this rational learner account, which basically argues that children have and retain relational concepts from an early age, but that the particular nature of their prior experience leads them to privilege, give more weight to some types of hypotheses over others, right? And this is a good strategy because when we're trying to come up with hypotheses to explain the world, to explain things that we see, it's usually the case that the evidence is consistent with a whole vast array of possible solutions, right? So in order to constrain this possibility space, we have to rely on learned biases. You can think of these as these general principles that have been proven to have explanatory power for our particular environment in the past, right? For a particular type of problem. So what this means, though, is that given the right input, we should be able to override these tendencies, which are really there to help us out, right, in making the correct answer, correct selection, in order to consider something that was initially less likely or that we treated as initially less likely, right? And so from this perspective, any input, there's no privileged input here, any input that changes the learner's expectations about the most likely relationships that might exist should influence the hypothesis that they privilege and then ultimately apply in these tasks. And in fact, looking at the sort of vast array of studies, these are just some recent ones that I've been inspired by in both children and adults. I don't follow the adult literature as closely, sorry, adult literature people, using a whole range of interventions, right? So these include labeling, comparing, verbalizing, relational priming, all these cool interventions. You could think of these as being consistent with this rational framework, right? Because each of these provide different sources of input that might change the constraints placed on children's hypothesis space, influencing which hypothesis they're going to wind up privileging for a particular task. So I'm going to end now with a very brief summary of some additional ways that we've been trying to use context in my lab as input to facilitate abstract reasoning in older 3-year-olds who, again, usually fail on the kinds of tasks that I'm going to show you. I need more water. 1 second. So one idea was just to manipulate the design of the environment or the features of the problem itself in order to cue children to the potential relevance of the relational hypothesis here, right? To sort of get them to attend to this hypothesis. So the idea here is that if design features of the learning environment are a constraint that even young children are sensitive to and that they're considering, then the physical features of some artifact or object should change the salience of different causes in one of these causal systems, right? So to do this, literally all we did was we compared that original task where we put objects on top of the flicker detector toy. And we know that children fail and they failed again. We replicated that finding. And we compared it here to these, we put these transparent bins on either side of the toy. And instead of placing the objects down and putting them next to each other on top, we sort of cartoonishly went like this, and we inserted them into the sides where they were then visible. So this was a relatively subtle design cue, but it wound up heightening 3-year-olds' tendency to engage in relational reasoning. So that's all it took. And now all of a sudden, these 3-year-olds are noticing that the relation is important here, and they are privileging that in their responses compared to kids who performed a chance in the other condition. I think there's lots of questions about the mechanism here, and I would actually love your ideas. It's sort of underspecified. This is a pretty descriptive study here. And in fact, previous research from members of this group have applied design, right, design principle, different types of design principles to facilitate relational reasoning in museum exhibits. And there's this recent review paper that's really lovely talking about how you can do this for the biological domain. Dudry Gentner has that really cool work with these sort of comparing structures in the physical domain. And in these cases, or the design is being used to facilitate comparison, which is another context that can tip the scales in favor of relational responding, right? And I love this work. I think it's super cool. Okay, so in addition to changing the physical design of the stimuli, there's some lovely recent work. This isn't my work, but this is a colleague of mine from Mariel Gadou that's also sort of in this vein, where she's arguing that presenting relational information in a causal context is sufficient to facilitate children's reasoning about these kinds of more abstract transformations. So harder than same different, things like growing and shrinking and reflecting, multiplying, right? All different kinds of sort of more complicated relational transformations. She did 2 different studies with 2-year-olds and with 3-year-olds. One uses a sort of magic wand to do the causal transformation. One uses a special box where you put things inside. And in both cases, just sort of putting these transformations in a causal context seems to increase children's ability to recognize these relations and use them to make future inferences. So lastly, I have another line of work where I study how children's questions, and in particular, how asking children for explanations can lead them to look for abstract patterns or broad regularities in the data that they observe. This could be a totally different talk on explanation. I applied these ideas here to examine whether a prompt to explain would sort of provide this context internally, right? So the idea is that it would prompt children to privilege the abstract relation over an object match. This is work I started in grad school, and then I was like, it went on hold, and then I waited patiently until my graduate student, Eric Brockbank, who's pictured here, took it back up recently, and so we're finishing the paper now, and it's under revision, so actually I'm really interested in your feedback here. So in the study, the experimenter demonstrated how to match cards. This was the video that I showed you earlier, right? They did this sort of standard relational match to sample task, and they said, this is how I play my game, right? And they matched the cards. And this control condition that you already saw was just compared with an explain condition where the experimenter asked them to explain why they made the match in the way that they did. And they went through a variety of trials, sort of 6 sets of these in either condition. So let me just show you what the explain condition looked like.
See this card right here? Can you see these 2 cards? In my game, this card goes with this card. Can you tell me why I said this card goes with this card? to say okay. In my game, this card goes with this card. So now it'll be your turn. These two cards. Which one? These two cards goes with this one.
Okay, 5-year-old, right? So then explanations used to facilitate this inference. And these questions were more than enough to help children to recognize the appropriate solution. So they were asked to generate their own response during 6 trials. So we alternated between the experimenter demonstrating, prompting them to point or explain, and then the child had a turn to make a match. And they did this 6 times over the course of a total of 12 trials. And so what we find here, right, is that this was enough to help children recognize that the appropriate solution here was to match according to the abstract relationship. Interestingly, and actually to our surprise, the number of relational matches remained consistent across trials, indicating no effective learning over multiple trials. So children were just as effective at selecting the relational match on trial 1, the first time they did this, as they were on trial 6, after receiving this intervention, this sort of explanation prompt. They did it immediately. This also sort of challenges a little bit one interpretation of this, which is that children are sort of picking up on these relational concepts by means of comparing across trials, right? It seems like maybe there's a different mechanism here, which is explanation. But there's still lots of questions about the mechanisms underlying explanations effects on these kinds of tasks. So the amount of time that children spent processing each wasn't correlated with performance, so that's useful to know. But of course, explanation requires a verbal response, right? And you might have heard that kid used the word same actually in one of his explanations. And other researchers like Sims and Richland, for example, recently have shown that just verbalizing the relation can in fact help with this kind of abstraction. So to start to address this, I think we can take a look at the specific types of explanations in the explanation condition that children actually generated in this task. And you can see here that there's these object explanations, right, that sort of focus on the features of the objects. And then there's relational explanations, and these vary quite a bit. So some of the children, I haven't done this analysis yet because a reviewer requested it, so I will. Some of the children use the phrase same or different, right? Others used variations on this. So they'll say like they're double, or they're both O's, like that child also did, or they're both matching, right? So they're sort of not using the actual words, but they're giving a relational concept. And then there was a couple kids that gave sort of irrelevant explanations that kids are kind of prone to do. You'll notice here that providing a non-explanation actually was sufficient. So just being asked to explain, at least for these 2 kids, again, we can't really generalize here, but it seems like the thing that didn't work was the minority of kids that produced an object-based explanation, right? Where those kids actually went on to privilege the object match in this task, even in the explain condition, which is interesting. So if you guys have suggestions for other things to analyze here in this qualitative data, it's a relatively small data set because there's not that many kids in the explanation condition, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Okay, concluding, right? So hopefully I've convinced you at least a little bit of the children's tendency to privilege these sort of surface features or objects over abstract relations may itself be learned, that it's context dependent, and that it's malleable. And this is good news, right? Because it really provides a way to create better learning environments that might support children's recognition of abstract structure in the world. And I've been really inspired by all of you who have already been working on this, and I'm hoping to join in. So that's my plan for the future. And these are just a subset of the people that have played an important role in getting this work done. So thank you all so much for your attention.